Okay, sorry, this is a bit of a weird one. We've just finished watching The Virtues, and as promised, we said we'd upload our review. So we are filming our review, and you've probably noticed it's just me. So Nadia has said to send a message to all of our lovely subs saying how much she was blown away by the series The Virtues, the final episode. She was just left so emotionally bereft and wrecked and emptied by the last episode. She genuinely didn't feel she could go on camera and talk about it. I mean, guys, if you've seen it, it's the final episode, episode 4 of The Virtues by Shane Meadows, based, unfortunately, on the experiences that Shane Meadows, I think, came to an awareness of later in his life, a little bit like the character Joseph, played by Stephen Graham. This episode, like all the rest, was just absolutely magnificent, if that's the right word. It was an intensely traumatic watch, as we inevitably headed towards the... It was a bit like Apocalypse Now, with his sort of journey to the end of the river, and to the source, if you like, the wellspring of all of the horror and upset and the sort of hidden issues that he'd been burying for so many years. And finally, in this episode, it was revealed that Stephen Graham's character was tragically raped at the age of 9 at the home that he was at. And so, you know, he sort of arrives at his journey's end, really. And the episode got underway with the sister of Stephen Graham, Joseph's character, leaving him and Dina, the sister-in-law, played by Neem Alga, looking after their children. And after last week, where obviously they'd had a bit of a kind of drunken moment together, immediately this kind of left us all feeling extremely anxious. And I think that's kind of like the thing with this series, is there isn't a scene, however benign that scene is or however innocent the scene is. I don't know about you, but we've just been on the floor with tension and anxiety and worry and fear. And as Dina took her top off and it looked like they were going to get jiggy with it and they were going to kiss, and you were just like... And then, of course, sadly, Joseph has has this fit whilst they're sort of being romantic, and that in a sense is the sort of moment of realization and the access point at which Stephen Graham's character sort of realizes the full extent of what's happened to him. So he goes into hospital, and again, each of the scenes where just these incredibly... On the one hand, I want to say they're sort of long and they're just held for a long time, these scenes. I'm thinking of the scene of the sister and Stephen Graham in the hospital. They are held for a long time, but that suggests they're held and, you know, perhaps they're a bit boring. But I said to Maddie, as I looked up at one point, I said that it demands your full attention, every scene. And that's not necessarily because it's shot well, it's because these characters are in situations and are in scenes that are so real and yet so dramatic that you feel like you've been put in this totally privileged position of quite literally a fly on the wall. And yet it's more than documentary, it's just... It's quite a unique thing that Shane Meadows has managed to pull off in this series, I think. It's so real, and yet at the same time it's sort of hyper real, and you sort of feel just... It's like watching a terribly slow car crash happening, and you just can't pull your eyes away from it. And so he ends up in hospital, and then he goes off to see the bloke from the worksite, Craigie, the guy who he has this strange sort of connection with, because they both felt like, well, they were both boys at the home in which obviously we suspect that Joseph, Stephen Graham's character, was abused. So that, you know, they were both there. So anyway, so he goes to see Craigie, and when he goes to see Craigie, you've got this sort of parallel story going along where you've got Stephen Graham trying to work out what the hell happened to him and how it happened to him, and is he on a sort of revenge? Is it a sort of revenge narrative that he's on? He's going to go and avenge the crime that this guy did to him when he was younger. And then you've got Dina's character, who's told that actually her mother, Catholic mother, lied to her about letters that her adopted son, or the son that she had to put up for adoption, sent to her. So you have this, you know, sort of crisis and heartache and tug between two very strong storylines, very paralleled. And in this episode, Dina's storyline is given as much emphasis as Stephen Graham's. So there really is a sort of moment where her story sort of muscles for as much attention. And then Stephen Graham catches up with Craigie from the building site. And you realise that Craigie, the actor who plays Craigie, who's that? Mark O'Halloran, who plays Craigie, his face, I mean, you couldn't have a face that looked more haunted and more just torn to shreds and agonised over what's happened to him. Stephen Graham gets the name of the one surviving abusing boys from the home. So we discover that it wasn't the actual staff; it was some of the other teenage boys that was abusing them, and it was 2 of the teenage boys that raped Stephen Graham at the age of 9. Craigie gives him the name of one of them who's still alive, and he gives him the address. Now, meanwhile, whilst all that's going on, Dina has discovered that her mum had been lying to her and sort of concealing letters that her, the son that she'd lost to adoption had sent her. So she goes to meet her mum, see her mum at her mum's house, and Stephen Graham heads off to meet and find the guy, or one half of the guys, that raped him as a boy. And there were just some great moments. I think all of them, it's interesting, sometimes with dramas you can really feel the commercial breaks being ramped up to, building to it, and boom. Well, this does it in a very different way. You'd be left with such sort of hard cuts on a scene that looked like it was still going to develop, and yet at the same time you were desperate for the commercial breaks. I don't know if you were, just to take a breath, just to sigh, just to breathe, a breath of relief, because the tension and the building and the brooding sense, and PJ Harvey's music in the background, just this grinding sort of guitar and what have you. I mean, I think it rinsed Nadia out. That's why she just at the end of it went, I can't talk about this, it's too much. So I'm afraid you've just got me. Stephen Graham finds Damon, the name of the guy who abused him, and then this sort of protracted situation. Damon's found, he's clearly not well. He's not lying in a perfect situation. It's a shithole with cans everywhere, and he's on a drip, and he's got television. I mean, it's a state of total degradation. And Stephen Graham comes in, and I mean, in a weird way, as soon as you saw the man who'd abused Stephen Graham on this bed, you knew that Stephen Graham had the upper hand, in a sense. As he says to him, he has a son, he can walk away from that room, whereas the guy who was the abuser, and there was a very challenging sequence where, the abuser talked about how he never knew a moment when he wasn't abused, and that's why he abused Stephen. He even managed to try and twist it around and suggest that Stephen could have had it even worse if it wasn't for him abusing him, and then Stephen running away from Stephen's character running away from the home. We're talking about, minuscule layers of what's better than what here, within a sort of ever diminishing cycle of, well, you got a better deal, then I got a better deal, then I got a better deal. And so it made you think about the cycle of abuse. And it led me and Maddie and Nadia all to have a very quick conversation about, yes, you need to understand that abused people can abuse other people, but the vast majority of people who are victims of abuse don't go on to abuse. So what is it that makes those few that do, if you know what I mean? So, I have to confess, I was standing there and Stephen Graham's face, which has just been this heartbreaking picture and image of the vulnerability, and even when he was rageful or has been rageful or drunk, you just see how vulnerable and sad he is behind his eyes. And I just wanted him to kill him. I mean, I hate to say it. I mean, I just wanted him to kill him. And, it's a tough end. And irony, and what I liked about it, and what I liked about the way Shane Meadows sort of contrasting this situation with Stephen Graham and his abuser, and then Dina's character with her mum, is that death does happen. But it doesn't happen where you think it's going to happen. So if you haven't seen it, that's the one spoiler I won't give you. Death does happen at the end of this episode, but not quite where you're expecting it. And so it was just a brilliantly tense, honest, searingly real. And when you then know that in interviews with Shane Meadows, the director, this is the story of what happened to him, and he went through this sort of, I hate to use the word eureka. Eureka sounds like it's a moment of great realisation, but he had that moment. He had an epiphany. He had a moment at some point when he wasn't making films, and he realised what had happened to him, and he had to go on this great long journey to the heart of his own soul and sort of burrow around and work out what the hell had happened to him. When you know that that's happened in real life, it just gives this whole series another dramatic resonance that's just truly, truly heartbreaking. And of course, it's the story of what's happened to so many people, and there but for the grace of God go I. I mean, we've all had close encounters with abusive situations. We've all had experienced abuse in very different ways. So this will resonate for so many people. And then of course you had the additional tragedy of Craigie, the other guy, the other grown-up guy who was the other boy at the home, who felt guilty because, of course, he was not happy, but he was hoping that when Stephen Graham was a boy at the home, that he'd be taken off, because it meant that Craigie wouldn't be abused himself. So, you know, the guilt that he would feel. And of course, sadly, he kills himself in the episode too. He hangs himself with the trauma and sadness. So it's a bleak watch, man. It's a bleak watch. And I don't know how many series of this heavy bleakness we could cope with in a year or in a couple of months, but it's proper top drawer drama. This is when television drama reminded me of the days of Dennis Potter. This is like top drawer, in your face. You're going to be deeply uncomfortable. You're going to be made to squirm. You're going to be made to wriggle. You're going to not be comfortable. And that's the point of good drama. We don't all want to sit there, you know, eating just junk food all the bloody time. Junk food's great some of the time, but this is not junk food. This is one of those top drawer dramas, brilliantly acted. No one acted in this. No one acted in this. They were all those characters. This was an absolute top drawer lesson in authenticity of performance. I mean, you know, what these guys were pulling on, the scenes that the director enabled them all to partake in, whether he was running them all on many cameras, which I know he was on some scenes, it really helped give the entire proceedings a sense of this was like we're ringside to real life, but real life that was just a real life we didn't really want to be a real life. So anyway, so me and Nadia and Maddie just want to thank all of the production team. I want to thank the cast, and we just if you haven't seen it, check it out. It really will blow your brains out, but you really do need to see one of it. You can't binge watch it. You need to see one episode a week. Good old-fashioned television styly.